Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Scott McCloud.
Countdown for blast off. X minus 5, 4, 3, 2, X minus 1, fire.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this show, we're really excited to have Scott McCloud. His most recent book, The Sculptor, came out several months ago, and he has been a very busy man since then. But he did take time out of his busy schedule to talk with us.
Yeah, this is great. This is one of my, bucket list gets for interviews for this show. So this is exciting that we had this opportunity.
Yeah, it's a great interview. But, before we listen to that, we want to let all of our listeners know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are at 20 to 35% off cover price, and every single month you're going to find incredible specials, not just for May. Now, sometimes those specials are at 45% off cover price, sometimes they're 50% off, but many times the discounts are more impressive than that.
That's right, and this month, as in most months, they have a load of bundles that you can take advantage of, where you can get a deeper discount for multiple comics from the same publisher than you would get if you bought those books individually. This month they have 5 different bundles from DC Comics that range from 45 to 50% off. Bundles from Marvel, Dynamite, Valiant, and Vertigo as well. So you can check those out and get some big discounts on the books you order.
That's right. Every month they have incredible savings, and you got to go to their website to find out what they are. And that's dcbservice.com. Go there, run there, right now, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do go there, please be sure to get in touch with them. Send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Andy, this was a fun interview.
Yeah. So we cover actually a wide range of things, starting out with The Sculptor, but getting into understanding comics and web comics and even kind of bigger philosophical issues about comics and art and so on. Which
you would expect with Scott McCloud.
Yeah, that's true. And just a warning in advance for listeners, I step into some spoilery territory at the beginning of the interview, and Scott pulls me back from that. So my apologies to listeners about that, but it's there. So
I don't think it's too bad, but we'll let listeners judge for themselves. So let's go ahead and give it a listen.
Yep. happy today and excited to have Scott McCloud with us to talk about his latest work, The Sculptor, as well as many of his other works. And I know, Derek and I have both used Understanding Comics in the classroom, so we'll probably get to stuff with that as well. But so thanks for joining us, Scott.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great having you on the show.
And so I wanted to start with, since you're, it seems like you've just undergone this kind of massive world tour. Is that right?
Yeah, we're counting it at about 9 countries in 100 days or so. And pretty much nonstop travel. There weren't a lot of times when we spent more than a couple of days in a hotel.
Wow. And so, what kind of reception did the Sculptor get from this tour, and seeing how different people looked at and read the book? Was there anything that kind of surprised you, or that you especially liked about the responses you got?
I talked to a lot of people who read it in one sitting. I thought that was interesting. A lot of reporters would come in and just say, yeah, I started reading it and thinking I would, take it in a few different sessions, and then they just didn't want to put it down. So and that's always good. It's like I like with Understanding Comics, I like measuring my books and how much inconvenience they cause. So, I want to hear about people who like showed up and got a D on the test, or missed a train stop, or there was an art director at Whole Earth Catalog or Utney Reader or something who fell off a chair, and so that's always good if people felt like they couldn't stop, and that probably is the most common response that I've heard, which is the opposite of reinventing comics, where the most common response, even years after the book came out, was, yeah, I'm still working on that one.
Oh, man.
My troubled middle child.
Let me ask, how do you feel when readers come up to you and say, hey, I read it in one sitting?
It's fine. Even if it only took 2 or 3 hours, I figure if the experience was strong enough that, that they're thinking about it afterwards, which is usually, one of the next things they say, then at some point they might reread it, and then I can double the time, Mm-hmm. I sort of like, okay, how do I notch up how much time it took? If they got to read it twice, I can double that. And, it takes a couple of hours to see a movie. And the movie takes 2.5 years, and I took 5 years doing this thing. But then again, when you see the movie, you watch those 1,000 names scrolling up at the end. So I don't know. I think the work to reading time ratio is pretty good, but it's definitely a fast read. It definitely goes by pretty quick.
And I was asking because I think it was not long after, maybe about a year after Gilbert Hernandez's Palomar collection, that first really big tome, came out, and he commented that people had come up to him and said, "Hey, this is great. I read it in one sitting." His reaction was, "My God, why did it take so short a time? It took me so long to pull everything together." And he felt a little mixed about that. So I was wondering, from a creator standpoint, how you felt about that.
Well, actually, I got to say, that sounds kind of nuts.
Yeah.
Read all the Palomar? Oh, come on. The Palomar stories, that'd take me like 3 days. No, those are crazy. I don't know. That's nuts. Because there were a lot of Palomar stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my God, and his words per panel I'm pretty sure is higher than mine. No, that's crazy. No, I mean, but basically, I mean, as far as the metrics go, okay, what was I looking for? What effect did I want to have? I said from the beginning that job one for this particular book, I wanted to make a page turner. I wanted to make something that people felt compelled to keep reading, and there were even ways that I put it together which were more geared towards sort of the panel-to-panel flow in a way that was kind of page agnostic, so that there was this sort of pull driving you from panel to panel and keeping you going. So I wanted a sense of momentum that kind of plowed past what I think sometimes we get a little hung up on the page as a compositional unit, and we want to create something that's kind of balanced or harmonious or that has this identity all by itself. Sometimes because people want to sell the things, later on. And this time I wanted it, I don't know, I wanted it to just kind of pull and pull and pull so that there was no out. You had to keep going.
It also seems to be a book that not only kind of pulls you through, but lends itself then to multiple readings.
I hope so. There are a few different structures you can go with. You can create something that's kind of a puzzle where you have to really think about it and put it all together, or you can create a story that's more like a lake where if you want to read it just kind of on a surface level, that it might work on that level, but then if you want to dive underneath, it can work on that level too. And I guess I'm more of a fan of the latter structure, so I was trying to do that. In one way, it's just kind of an adventure story, really.
And we may end up getting kind of spoilery in this discussion, I would imagine, because, well, the book's been out a while too, so we can probably do that a little bit. But one of the things that I noticed in rereading, I mean, probably the biggest thing is on the first read, I didn't quite get that that David's final work is referenced earlier in the book, that he's creating that image from memory rather than from out of the blue, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, that is kind of spoilery. So I don't know if I want to go any further down that road.
Okay.
Let's start with the ending.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about this too because I just read the interview you did recently with the Comics Journal, which was all about the ending. So,
well, that was Tasha Robinson had actually approached me about some stuff that I talked to her. She did an interview for, I forgot where it was for earlier, and it asked me if we had talked a little bit about some of the stuff that was buried in there. And she said at some point that we might want to do an interview later on just specifically about that stuff. And I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. And I basically, first second was so wonderful to me that I pretty much said yes to everything up to a certain point. But then when she actually called, then, I think she had told me this, but I'd kind of forgotten it. Said, yeah, it's just going to be about the ending and it's for the Comics Journal. And it was really funny because I thought on the phone, I thought to myself, well, that sounds like a colossal mistake. But I said yes. So I couldn't, that was it. So I thought, oh, okay, let's do it. Yeah. But, no, I mean, if I had really thought it through, I would have thought, no, that sounds like probably the worst idea imaginable.
Well, then we won't go further down that road here.
Yeah. Well, without asking you to give anything away that would approach spoilerdom, I know the ending is, at least the very last section in the book, which I'm looking now begins on page 484. That was one of the topics of discussion that Andy and I addressed when we reviewed the book on the podcast back in February, soon after its release. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we were speculating on is how would the narrative be different without those last several pages? Now, it's kind of a question that you really can't answer because we had already read it, so we had that experience. So we couldn't speak from a standpoint, unless we had serious memory problems, of what would it be like if we didn't know that was the ending. And I remember saying something to the effect of, if I could kind of project, let's say me forgetting what that very last part was. I mean, I could see the book ending before that last section and still being a very satisfying narrative. So I guess, again, without giving anything away, had you considered in the construction of the book maybe leaving off those last several pages? Are
we talking about the last few pages, or are we talking about the whole last
after she whispers in his ear?
Okay. I see. Okay, because the story ends and then it ends and then it ends. It's
right.
frickin' Return of the King or something. But,
so when it comes out as a movie, it'll be 3 movies.
Yeah. Let's see. I think that would be an acceptable ending. I would not be more fond of it, because for me that the last grace note is for me the most important one. But I could see, having it be more fully circular and just sort of spinning off into that private moment. I could see that working on some level. But it'd be a different story. But for me, the ending was always, I don't know. The ending was one of the earliest things in the story, and was one of the very few things that went through very few revisions. And to me, it was just like the ending resonates backwards throughout the story,
right,
and helped determine the structure of the story in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know that, as you mentioned, what we see in those last few pages is something that we wouldn't get if you had ended the story after, he whispers, or she whispers. But I think one of the reasons why I thought that would be a fascinating way to end the narrative is I tend to privilege ambiguity when it comes to my stories. And I know a lot of readers don't. They like things maybe not completely tied up, but a little more tied up than I do. And I like the possibility of multiple open endings. And so I thought, that would be not only a way of bringing visual closure, because you have, that scene where they're in bed together and there's the whisper. So you end as you begin, but also there would be a big question mark at the end. Well, what was said and what happened? And I think that just leaving things in that way, it would probably aggravate more readers than you would want to aggravate. But at the same time, it's something that I tend to really appreciate.
Well, I actually like both kinds of stories. I mean, you're talking to somebody who really enjoyed the ending of the Sopranos, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
that was a lovely. Well, maybe "lovely" is the wrong adjective, but it was haunting. I spent a lot of time thinking about it afterward. It sort of comes together in your mind, but never completely. I thought it was a great way to end that show. But as I say, I enjoy both kinds of stories. What you're describing is more the puzzle model, and I guess I was going for Lake, right? I was going for more of a sense of straight clarity, A to B through a very, very circuitous route, or maybe A to A, really, since it comes full circle in some ways. But that then could be read at multiple depths, Mm-hmm. So it still works as a linear story, but it could be read in other ways as well.
This actually ties into a bigger discussion that I was kind of thinking of as reading this book, and that is about the nature of David's art. So, David gets this, we kind of jumped to the ending and we didn't talk about something that the book's about, but the nature of David's art is he has this power to basically turn anything into into whatever he imagines, and he goes through different types of work. I guess he does both kind of abstract and representational art, but for me the most fascinating work he produces is the giant ball in the apartment.
The big ugly ball, as his granduncle Harry, a.k.a. Death, describes it at one point.
Right, yeah. Because that's a work in which the reader has to imagine what's inside it. We don't see it, right?
Well, I have to say that all the work that we see in the story, in one way or another, fails. We only ever see David's failures. He had some successful work early in the book. We never actually see that stuff. Like we hear that before the story started, he had a little bit of success, a brief period of success when he was very young. And we also know that he makes he makes some sculptures that impress his friend Oliver, who works in the gallery, about midway through the book. But we don't see that either. We don't see those either. All we ever see are the things that fail. And I think that's partially because, I think it would be foolish for me to embark on like trying to draw greatness. It's ridiculous. It's like Reed Waller had talked about how it's silly to start out. This is a guy who did, sex comics, something called Omaha the Cat Dancer a long time ago. And he had talked about how it's ridiculous to set out to draw sexy. It's like trying to make Lincoln look historical, and I think that I feel that same way about, trying to create greatness. I think of like William Goldman in Adventures in the Screen Trade. He had this sort of this test script that he tried out on a friend of his by way of demonstration. He wrote this sample script about this amazing barber who gave great haircuts. And he gave it to his friend, the director, George Roy Hill. And Hill just ripped him a new one because he said, how the hell am I supposed to show a brilliant masterpiece of a haircut on screen? You can't do it. You can't decide that something's great, So I gave myself the much easier task of drawing failures. And then I just had fun making them, look cool in the panel, okay, what would be fun to look at here? What would be fun to look at in this scene? And the ball was one of those things, but maybe it was a little bit closer to that ambiguity. In some ways, I think the best work that he makes in front of us is when he makes the underground sculpture that we never see at all. There's something, I think, more moving about that thing. And we don't even... Right. Something I didn't get to work into the story at all, but kind of hung over the story was Smithson. Is it Robert Smithson? I've forgotten his first name, but he was a sculptor who did land installations. And his most famous sculpture is the Spiral Jetty, which was this, big peninsula of dirt that goes out in a spiral and then just gets washed away by the water and by time. And then it's gone. And in a way, I think he was knocking on the same door that I was trying to knock on with some of this stuff.
Well, that leads to another question that I have regarding, I guess, potential ambiguity in the story, and that is how we are to read David. Now, I know that how a reader takes a particular character, situation, scenario, or setting is, by and large up to that reader. But many times, and an author will instill a certain attitude or tone into a character that we can, maybe or maybe not ferret out. And so I guess my question is, how do you feel that you try to frame David? Now, you mentioned that we mostly saw his failures, or when we saw what could be considered successful art, depending on how you define that, we saw it from askance, or we didn't see it very clearly, or at all. Do you see David in the story as a good artist?
Well, that's just it. I think a lot of people flicker back and forth. Does McCloud think that he's a great artist or a bad artist? As if those are the only two choices. Mm-hmm. That's not how I see artists, and that's not how I see art. I think that some of what he makes is intriguing, and then some of it just falls flat on its face. And clearly none of it quite rises to the level that it needs to, in order to have the effect that he wants it to. And I also think that the critic who talks about him, whether he's arrogant or not, whether this particular critic is a nasty person or not, is irrelevant. What he says about David, especially when he thinks David isn't listening, later on that night when he has the showing, is probably true on some level, and I think David thinks it's true on some level, that he's always looking over his shoulder, that he's too concerned about what others think. But, I think maybe the more interesting question is, do I think David is an asshole? And no, I actually don't. I don't. Yeah, it saddens me a little if people think he's just a flat out asshole. If they just want to condemn him, that they think that the whole story is just like, ha ha, look at this guy. It's like, no. That's definitely not my attitude at all. He's a problematic character. He's irritable. He's self-centered. He's myopic. He's a pain in the ass. But I still have some affection for him. And I think that, his clinging to things, clinging to his art, clinging to his silly promises that he makes to himself, to his ideals, however misguided or strange they might be, to me makes him at least a little bit heroic. And the idea of somebody who's irrational enough to just pursue something to the edge of reason and beyond is to me interesting and something that I find inspiring. And it's also, I think, in the craziness of it, I think it's something that's also has some piece of art in it. But, is he great or is he bad? To me, this is like, it's art itself, that people always want to ask the question, is it art or isn't it art? And I've always thought that that's the wrong question to ask, because there's a little art in everything we do.
Now, are these the kind of questions, because, you've had now several months of conversations and interviews and tours under your belt, and I'm sure that people are asking questions about this book. How should we read this, or what do you think about this, or did I read it incorrectly? Are these the kind of questions, for instance, David, in your relationship with him, that keep coming up with readers and interviewers, or what are the kind of questions that you see arising again and again over the past several months?
Actually, mostly people just ask me the same 3 or 4 questions over and over, and they are, why Sculptor? And not why was he not a graphic artist? And the answer is, well, that was the first idea I had, so I never actually questioned it until I started doing interviews. Why the blue? Like, why did I pick just the blue color? Which had a lot to do with my own limitations as a colorist and the fact that I wanted some middle tone. And then I've forgotten the other ones. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've probably done 200 interviews in the last 100 days or so. So it's all a bit of a blur, to be honest. I would love to see it if you can ask me a question I haven't been asked. That could be interesting.
Well, whether I do or not, I do have to say that I didn't even think about asking, why a sculptor, why not a cartoonist?
Good for you.
Have you ever prank called Bob Harvey and just said, it's images in sequence, click?
Never.
Okay.
Bob's actually a sweet guy and an old friend. No, and I remember when I went to the first Comics Arts Conference, very first one, and it was about 12 of us, and I think it was at San Diego. I'm pretty sure it was San Diego, and Will Eisner was there. And it was like 1991, I think. So Understanding Comics was about to come out. And basically we sat down and had a little good-natured debate, and it never ended. Bob and I, have always disagreed about that definition, but at this point it's just sort of a running joke. There's a very collegial atmosphere, as you know, amongst comic scholars, this weird tribe. But I kind of it's funny because I kind of drifted from that scene almost immediately, because I fell down the digital rabbit hole pretty much as soon as Understanding Comics came out. And like all of the theories in the book, I figured, well, they're in the book. I stopped talking about them. It's very weird.
That's interesting because, as you know, about 6 months ago, we started a monthly episode on the Comics Alternative devoted specifically to webcomics. And one of the first completed webcomics that we wanted to discuss, or we decided to discuss, was The Right Number Parts 1 and 2. Now, I know technically it's not completed, but since you hadn't updated it in so long, we were considering it, completed for our purposes. And, it's, I think, a wonderful example of what webcomics can do and continue to do. And I think it's more innovative than many of the webcomics that I see being created today. And I remember in reinventing comics, you really played up the potential of what the internet could do for the way we understand comics, as a medium. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned going down that hole of webcomics. Do you feel that over the past several years you've drifted from that hole? And is there you feel a need to maybe get back into webcomics more now that let's say you've gotten the Sculptor out of the way?
That's on the list, although the next project I'm going to do is a nonfiction book about visual communication. Mm-hmm. So I need to get that off my table first. But right now, the biggest hole in my resume is kind of finishing the job as far as the infinite canvas goes. Really attacking that and seeing if I can create something of lasting value and readability and, just something that has a real solidity to it, that isn't just some kind of proof of concept. And I like The Right Number. And I actually, there were a lot of things about it that I was fond of, but I feel like at this point, in order to finish it, I actually need to go back and probably start from scratch. Just redo parts 1 and 2. My art's gotten better and it needs to have a different approach, I think, to truly work, many years later. So it's a big job, but, I think one of the things that I kind of regret about the debate over, webcomics was the fact that I was always talking about some of these crazy new shapes that webcomics could take. And I still think that that's a very exciting frontier, but I don't know if I correctly got across a lot of the just basic practical storytelling benefits of treating the screen as a window instead of a page. There's some really important benefits that I think people have only just begun to scratch the surface of. And one of the most important is things like the distance between panels or the ability to compose comics the way you would compose a piece of music. We tend to forget that on the printed page, as soon as you choose the size and shape of panel 1, you've already restricted the size and shape of panel 2. That's a pretty basic limitation on the printed page of the page itself, right? Mm-hmm. And I just don't think that even a lot of experimental webcomics, even people who've played with the infinite canvas, haven't necessarily explored what just straight storytelling can be like in an untethered environment like that. It'd be very exciting. But I was just too busy just trying to say, hey, look over here, over here, over here. And it's like I had just come over the ridge and seen 100 square miles, and I would just got on my motorcycle and say, come on, trying to drive to, instead of actually picking a patch of ground and planting something in it and seeing what could grow in that ground. I'd like to do the latter, I think, when I come back.
So, in understanding comics, you talk about these different the different types of panel transitions and so on. And that, you do this kind of nice study of how Western comics focus on maybe just 3 types of those panel transitions. Is there something with what you're describing with webcomics here that would open the door to more exploration of those transitions that we don't see in that often in Western comics?
Well, I think you're going to have different kinds of transitions spatially, but whatever's possible in print in terms of what happens from panel 1 to panel 2 is going to be possible on the web. In fact, when I teach my workshops, I teach a 2-day workshop and sometimes a 5-day. And I can go for a really long time without even mentioning technology. I'll give examples from the web, examples from print. And it's all the same because the basic storytelling texture, all the basic storytelling decisions we make should work in either form. It's more just a question of flow. Okay, how does the thing flow? And, are we going multi-directional? Are we going to, have this thing laid out in one long string? And, what are the advantages of that? But still, in terms of the content of the panel, if you're, showing somebody picking up a glass and then in the next panel, there's water on the floor, I think what happens in the mind is comparable, regardless of whether you're looking at that on the screen or looking at it in print. These are the things that don't change. I compare it to, the fact that humans and monkeys have more or less the same DNA. I think it's something like 98% of the DNA that we share. But the 2% makes an enormous difference, that simple thing that you're going from one petri dish to another can result in some very crazy different mutations, but it's still the same animal underneath.
One of the things that this makes me curious about is, kind of getting us back into the Sculptor too, is that I've read in interviews you talk about that kind of realization where you were about to hit 500 pages and certain choices had to go into what you include and what you leave out.
Well, that was going on all along, actually. I was constantly thinking in terms of like chopping away stuff. And, the book was about 425 pages, I think, when in my first pass, maybe 440. And, I was very ruthless and I did a lot of cutting and I cut it and I cut it and I cut it and I took out this scene and I took out that scene. And it was 500 pages. It just grew anyway, because it needed more, there were certain scenes needed more. And also I chose a pacing that was based on kind of these micro moments within conversations where I just decided I wanted to capture the texture of people in conversation. And that includes, moments where you stop talking or you look to the side or you pause or you break words apart. And I wanted to make sure that I had a separate panel with separate facial expression, separate body language for each emotional moment. And that meant that a conversation could go for like 30 pages or more. And I just wanted that experience, even if it meant a lot more drawing, which in the end it did. It did mean a lot more drawing.
And you have pages and pages of moment-to-moment transitions.
Yeah, I do.
As well.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, the whole thing. And this is actually one of the reasons why the book, I think, people have said it feels very cinematic. It is. I always thought that it, felt a little bit like a movie. Sometimes, though, we can get a feeling that that a comic is borrowing stuff from cinema in order to achieve that effect. But I actually think that comics can achieve that sense of nowness, that sense of verisimilitude, but coming from a different path. Using comics techniques, you can achieve something comparable to movies, and so that it feels a little like watching a movie because it has that presence. But it's not necessarily because you're reaching into the toolbox of techniques from movies. It's just that both art forms can achieve that.
So would you see yourself conceiving of a work, maybe not thinking about what would the Sculptor be like if it were a web comic, but conceiving of another web comic, would you not have those kind of the same considerations for, I'm about to hit this length. I may need to leave some stuff out, or, or would those considerations be conceived, I guess, differently?
Well, I mean, let's face it. With a web comic or a printed comic, the thing could be as long as it needs to be, aesthetically. I mean, there's nothing to stop you from making it longer and longer and longer, except your own patience. The reason why people run into these problems is because of contracts and physical, limitations or particular formats that are pre-agreed upon, or just running out of money, running out of time, all those sorts of things. But there's nothing inherent to print that says that you can't go to 500 or 600 or 700 pages. There's nothing inherent to the web. if I was working on the web, one of the biggest differences for me is I would have taken that panel to panel to panel to panel aesthetic and just ran with it all the way. I would have never had to decide where the panel breaks came. Where the page breaks came.
Right.
With the Sculptor, I tried to think in terms of the panel to panel, but I obviously had at least half an eye on the page structure as I went, especially in terms of things like establishing shots and all, which work best, I think, at the top of the page.
That leads me to a question about your role, or at least your reputation as a comics theorist, someone who is very much aware of the form, the moving parts behind comics and comics narrative and all of that, and then your role as an artist. Now, I know that you have created, let's say, non-essay comics since the publication of that trilogy, Understanding, Reinventing, and then Making Comics. But this is your first really long, sustained work since those 3 books. Now, do you feel that you were creating the Sculptor with a lot of the other stuff in your head? For instance, the fact that I am the one who wrote Understanding Comics. I am the one who wrote Making Comics. Or maybe another way of asking this is, have you encountered, over the past several months, readers who feel that the Sculptor is the kind of graphic novel written by someone who would write Understanding Comics? And I say this, we often hear that, if an academic, someone who's an English professor writes a novel, sometimes the criticism, if it's criticism, is that, this is the kind of novel that an English professor would write. Right, because they teach it, and so they're very much aware of the mechanisms behind the fiction, and you can tell that they do that. So, have you had that kind of reaction or felt that yourself?
Actually, no. I mean, I know you guys had said that on first reading that you found it difficult not to think about the theory and the techniques going into it, vis-a-vis the books. I got to say though that's not been very common. Most people just read it as a story pretty much straight. And, sort of maybe started out thinking, all right, let's see how the theories check out. And then within 4 or 5 pages, it was just, they kind of fell into the story and lost themselves. And that's been the most common reaction. In fact, I guess maybe one of the one evidence of that is that almost all of the comments I get are about the story specifically. Well, not all of them. I mean, certainly people will come and talk about the art, but, it's just, I think the thing is a little opaque that way, for most readers. Now, obviously we have 2 exceptions. I'm talking to 2 exceptions because I think both of you had said that you found yourself noticing a lot of the techniques from Understanding, from Making Comics and all. But I haven't heard that very often, actually.
Well, keep in mind, I mean, we're 2 people who have taught a lot of comics, and in the classroom use Understanding Comics on a fairly regular basis.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, you're if anyone's going to notice it, you are. But I was definitely trying to bury a lot of that stuff, especially in the first pass. Now I did 4 passes on the layouts, and it took me a couple of years just on the layouts before I ever drew a single finished panel. And during that first pass, I pretty much just relied on my instincts. And then when I was coming back and I was fixing things, then I kind of pulled out the toolkit again. And then I was more, using a lot of the same analytical tools that I talk about, especially in Making Comics. But it was a different sort of a challenge for me than it would have been for anyone else. Because, I wrote the book, and there had to be pressure, especially after Making Comics. That's when there was a real bullseye on my chest, I think. After I did a book on how to make comics, I can't imagine anything that would put more pressure on me than that. But it was good. I mean, actually, the pressure was very healthy, and it kept me in my seat. It kept me working. So that was all fine. But like I said, it was more on a diagnostic level that I pulled that stuff out. You have to be able to reach into your instincts when you're first creating a story. In fact, a lot of the technical challenge for me was just working out the structure of the story itself, which is something that gets all of 3 panels in making comics. I pretty much beg off the subject. I say a little bit about what characters want, and then I just move on because it's not a book about writing. Mm-hmm. I'm sort of assuming you already have a story to tell, and then I'm going to tell you how to tell it in comics. But so that was a challenge that I didn't have a book for. I hadn't written about. That was something I had to figure out on the fly, and that was a lot of fun.
Now, I went back to reread your introduction to the black and white Zot collection that came out not long after Making Comics. And one of the things that struck me is you make a comment in that introduction that around the time that Understanding Comics came out, you felt that your readers, like, oh, here's the guy of Zot who's writing this new book. And by the time you're collecting the black and white Zot, you're the guy who wrote Understanding Comics. And, oh, he did something called Zot. I wasn't aware of that, many readers may think.
Right.
So now, I mean, given your reputation, I mean, you're primarily known. I mean, those who know your work know of Zot. But I think, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I would guess that the vast majority of people who see the name Scott McCloud are going to immediately associate it, first and foremost, with Understanding Comics and then the reinventing and then the making. And that is your reputation right now. Do you feel that with the Sculptor, there may be some kind of shift, or do you feel some kind of shift in the way that, not that you see yourself as a creator, but that others will see you or may see you as a creator?
It seems to be happening. I mean, we're only 3 months in. I don't know if the Sculptor is going to push Understanding Comics out of the first line of my obit, as Gary Turrell had suggested, where it's way too early to tell that one. But there are definitely at least a few people who are getting Understanding Comics because it's by that Sculptor guy. In fact, I'm getting some people who had never read a graphic novel at all, so they obviously hadn't read Understanding. But yeah, I mean, the natural structure would be probably in a few months, I'll go back to being the Understanding Comics guy and the Sculptor guy. And Understanding is still, I think, the thing that people most associate with me. The other books they may not know about. They might not know about, certainly Reinventing. A lot of people don't know that Reinventing exists. In fact, I've heard plenty of people talk about my 2 books about comics. Reinventing's just kind of drowning in the background. It's kind of dated or whatever. But I'm hearing more and more people who think of Making Comics first, actually. Understanding Comics is becoming the book I wrote before that. Because Making is useful to them. If they want to make comics, they go out and buy that one. Understanding is, just this other thing that their teacher will tell them, oh, you ought to read that. Yeah.
For those of us who teach literature, it's Understanding Comics. For those who teach writing and creatively, it's Making Comics.
Yeah, Making it's interesting. I don't know. It's funny to watch these things shift over time. The only reason that Understanding Comics was done by the Zot guy is because I expected it to have a footprint as small as Zot. I expected it to more or less go to the same audience, which was not a big audience. But after a couple of months, it was clear that Understanding was going to travel places that Zot never did.
Well, Understanding Comics was originally put out by Kitchen Sink, right?
Actually, originally it was put out by Tundra Publishing, Kevin Eastman's
that's right.
company, which ceased existing pretty much the day that it came out. And if you look in the original edition, the very, very first printings given out at the Capital City Trade Show with gold ink on the cover, you have this whole page where I'm talking about the nature of iconography. And I have, this is not a pipe, this is not a cow, this is not a man, this is not a country. And one of them is, this is not a company, and it has the Tundra logo. It was true. As soon as the book came out, it was true. And
now that's not in there anymore?
No, because what happened was that when they went back to press, Dennis Kitchen of Kitchen Sink Press, who now was publishing the book, said we figured on the second printing that we would replace that by the Kitchen Sink logo. And I said, well, you can if you like, Dennis, but you may want to consider what happened to the last. And he laughed and he said, no, I'm not superstitious. And he put the Kitchen Sink logo there. And pretty much as soon as it came out, Kitchen Sink had ceased to exist too.
Wow.
Because my copy has the Tundra logo, so I didn't, I didn't even know that it was...
Yeah, no, you have the very first edition. But when DC Comics wanted to put their company logo there, but that was very interesting because they had.
Now, your experience with understanding comics, not too long after that came out, there was this long piece in the Comics Journal with a variety of artists, critics, reviewers, scholars, journalists, what have you, responding to understanding comics. And it's been a while since I've read that, but I came away with the tone that, these guys were thinking, well, who is this guy to tell us how to understand comics? And then you had a section where you responded. Now, it seemed to me at the time, and maybe I'm wrong, that kind of reaction that was printed in the Comics Journal seemed a little reactive, and not really attacking, maybe somewhat. Do you think, though, that kind of reaction, if that's what you thought you were getting, has been tempered over the years?
For understanding, maybe, but actually, it was about 5 years after the book came out.
Oh, it was that long? Wow.
Yeah, and I think it might have been Tom Spurgeon's last issue as editor. I think, I'm not sure. I think it's towards the end of his run on the Journal, and the tone actually varied. Most were at least a little snarky. Only one or two I would describe as thoroughly dismissive or anything. I'd been mostly ignored by the Journal, I think, for the first 5 years, but understanding was becoming more and more entrenched amongst young cartoonists by then, and I think Tom felt that it was. It made sense to sort of have a retrospective and get a variety of viewpoints on it, which I thought was cool. It was interesting. I knew that it would be brutal, but it could have been worse. Reinventing got a much more thorough takedown by Gary Groth, which is, I think, kind of legendary at this point. my debate with Gary. I'm still holding on to his quote, "Computers and clothes, the very idea." Which I hope to trot out on a T-shirt in about 10 years. But yeah, since then, I think, about the point where I was perceived by some people to have become something of an institution. I think that's where the hatred kind of coalesced and became a little more rock hard. But in those days, it was more. I think there were at least some people at the Journal who thought I was mostly harmless. They're long gone. I'm pretty much the Antichrist at this point.
Well, even outside of the Journal, I remember Dylan Sisson's filibustering comics was a little savage. And I remember when we met several years ago at A&M Commerce when you came as a speaker, you good-naturedly signed my copy of Filibustering Comics.
I love the cow panel. I think it's funny. I love the parodies. The parodies are great. There's one recently that was like really bizarre. It was an online thing. It was reminiscent of. There was a website called Superbad before the movie came out. There was a website called Superbad, and it was a little reminiscent of that. It's just real scrambled, strange, like 8-bit crazy art that had a lot of things with me in it. My favorite is actually Mark Martin's, where my brain gets eaten by rabbit gophers. If you to be a guy with a checked green jacket, and a lightning bolt in his chest who goes around pointing at things and explaining the world. Come on, that's comedy gold. But it's only really funny if he's getting punched in the face or thrown in a vat of acid or something like that. That's, it's the way humor works. It's not funny if you're just like congratulating him on his insights. It's not worth it. So yeah, it's the nature of parody. But I think there've been about a dozen of them or so. Mm.
So now, getting back to the Sculptor, when you were, first working on this, and you were saying that it's about 5 years in the making, while you were working on that, did you also have in mind other potential projects like this to follow up on it? Not that there's going to be a Sculptor 2 or anything like that, no, but and I'm not suggesting, or I don't want to seem like I'm suggesting that with your Understanding comics that turned into a trilogy of essay or expository type of comics. But do you feel that your creative trajectory now is more along the lines of something like a Sculptor?
No,
than earlier work.
Well, that's the thing, is I don't really have a creative trajectory. I never have. If you look at my career, it's more like, do you remember Spirograph? Are you the right age for that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It just goes back and forth and back and forth. And, I'm just sort of trying to hit all of the edges of the circle. So my only real trajectory has been whatever I just did, I'm probably going to do something different, because there were always some crazy weird things in between books. I mean, between Understanding Comics and Reinventing Comics, what did I do? I did some crazy web comics, and then I wrote some Supermans. It's oh no, maybe Superman was after. I think Superman was between Reinventing and Making. And those three books are all very different from one another. So as I say, the next project is a nonfiction book about visual communication, and then probably I will give webcomics another run, because it's certainly been long enough, and that's a pretty conspicuous blank spot in my resume. But no, I think really I'm just trying to run to all the different corners of the globe and see what comics can do. So the only real trajectory is out, I guess. It's just moving out from the center as far as I can go, and bouncing back and forth and back and forth. Hence the spirograph analogy.
Yeah.
When you say all the different corners of the globe, that's kind of literal in the sense of what you've just been doing with the publicity for the Sculptor. And I know that, was it about 10 years ago or so that you did the 50-state tour?
Yeah, for Making Comics, my family and I went to all 50 states, almost all of it by car, Hawaii being the only exception.
Yeah.
Hey, there's an interstate highway in Hawaii. Interstate 1. We never found the tunnel. But and England and Spain and all. But yeah, we're not going to do that again. But Ivy and I did a lot of travel. We went to I think it was 9 countries in about the last 100 days or so. And we'd done a lot of travel even before that. We just like traveling.
So you like traveling. Do you see it though as a necessary or important function of what you do in creating a work and getting out there to to meet people and talk to people about it?
It helps, but it's not necessary. I just see it as payback for all of the hours I spent at the desk drawing. Ivy doesn't see me a lot when I'm working hard on a project. I can work 11 hours a day, 7 days a week for years. And so it's payback. When I'm done, the deal is that now we see each other for 24 hours a day for a year or more. And that's what we've been doing. We've been traveling together. And it's pretty great. It's a sort of play hard, work hard kind of philosophy. There's a balance to it, a dynamic balance that I like. And of course I like seeing new things and all, but left to my own devices, I'd just be a hermit. I'd just be one of those guys locked in his apartment with the shades drawn, writing angry letters to the government or whatever. I can think of some artists who went that trajectory, and I think it's good that I got rescued by this woman who would rather see stuff and meet people and go out in the world. But But here too, I mean, there's a dynamic balance, a back and forth, a balance of extremes.
Well, I tried to get you for the South Carolina leg, but I was too late. So
sorry.
That's okay. That was one of it'll always be one of my career regrets.
Well, you tried to bring him to your school
for the 50 state thing,
yeah,
and Scott had already committed to Winthrop. So
Yep, we went to Winthrop for that when it was an art school in Raleigh for North Carolina, as I recall. I know the shape of the states now. Like I can look at a map, an unlabeled map, and I can point them all out.
Well, I'm glad we got you to come to A&M Commerce years before that 50-state tour, because you probably would have picked some other place in Texas besides Commerce.
No, I don't care where. I mean, like I went to Abilene, Texas, with tornadoes bearing down on me.
Yeah, but there's more to Abilene than Commerce.
Okay, I'll take your word for it. No, I've been in some pretty small towns. I don't know if you know Henderson State University in Arkansas. They're in Arkadelphia, and
oh yeah, Arkadelphia.
Not a whole lot of restaurants there, if I remember correctly. I know there's a Cracker Barrel a little outside of town. Not too many eateries. So yeah, no, I've been to some pretty small places. Probably one of the smallest was Haines, Alaska, which had the best small library in America, but it's not a big place.
The best small library?
Best small library in America. Yeah, when we were on tour. It's a great place, beautiful, gorgeous place, but not a huge population.
It wasn't like the library that Dylan Horrocks writes about, is it?
No, if only. Actually, Dylan right now is retracing my steps in Italy. He, as we speak, he's in Turin, I think, at this magnificent hall. I'm sure he's tweeting about it while we're talking to students at an art school in Turin.
You know. In fact, Horrocks is one, and it was before we really were recording that Scott, I had mentioned to you that you were basically my introduction to Seth, and I think that with Dylan Horrocks' work as well, I came to Hicksville through you, and I think it was Reinventing Comics. And this is one of the things you've said a couple of times in the interview, that Reinventing Comics seems to be overlooked. It doesn't get the attention that Understanding and even Making Comics seems to get. I don't know. My experience in reading Reinventing Comics, I really loved that book, and one of the reasons why is not only for what you had to say about what comics could become, internet and otherwise, but that book, much more so, I think, than in Understanding Comics, you mentioned and referenced a lot of different kind of comics, to where I remember the first time I was reading, taking notes about these creators or these books that if I wasn't familiar with, I should look up. And that's how I got to read for the first time It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken, and then Hicksville, and other such works. And so, I mean, I found that book a great value for that reason alone.
Well, as a time capsule, I think it's pretty interesting, because it's pointing out the interesting stuff being done at that point. And, now when we look back at the year 2000 or 2001, I've forgotten when it came out exactly. Some of the variety, some of the breadth of that scene might collapse a little in our memory. So it's nice that I have that sort of that record of all the cool stuff that was going on at the time. There's always a lot of cool stuff going on, and we can forget that. There was cool stuff going on in 1976. But now all I remember is, just the rotting newsprint in those days. But of course, that's not true. There was still, a lot of vestiges of the underground going on. I think Spiegelman was beginning to rev up by then. But reinventing is just, I don't think it's as strong as rhetoric, basically. I think Understanding, my first book was just better rhetoric. It was more convincing, and it flowed better. The storytelling was better. It was more readable. Reinventing was a little dense. There were a lot of panels of me just standing in front of icons talking. It was more talky, more wordy. Just the showmanship was I think less effective. I had sort of not completely understood what it was about understanding comics that worked. And of course, I was also talking about something external. And Steve Bissett had guessed that maybe what I was bumping up against was some of the limitations of the form itself. That I discovered that comics were really, really great at talking about comics. but when you're talking about, things that weren't happening in the panel, it got a little dicier. I think that's half true. But as we've seen with the nonfiction comics in the last 10 years or so, there's still an enormous amount of potential for comics talking about just about anything. Comics are a really powerful medium for nonfiction generally, but it's kind of a slam dunk when you're just pointing at something right in the panel, and you're saying, "Look at that! Look at what it's doing in your brain right now." That there was something very compelling about that was hard to replicate with Reinventing Comics.
As the guy who wrote Understanding Comics, Reinventing Comics, and Making Comics, do you find that a lot of readers or journalists or critics turn to you as some kind of arbiter of the zeitgeist? Do you get many questions? Well, what do you think of the comic scene today? Where are graphic novels going? Do you get that often?
I'll get those questions. It's not my strength because I'm drawing for so many hours every day that I don't get to read enough. And so that was actually one of the reasons it was nice to do Best American Comics last year, because I was literally forced to catch up. Got a mountain of comics from Bill Cardelopoulos, and I had to read them all. And that was actually a real gift, because it was like just jumping in the deep end of the pool after not having enough time to even get my feet wet for the last few years before that. So I fell way behind. I watch movies. I keep up with movies because Ivy and I can go see movies on those 2 or 3 hours that we have free at the end of the day. I listen to music because I can listen to music while I work, and ditto for podcasts. But comics, you need to sort of dedicate yourself to sit down and read a comic. It's not social, you're doing it alone, but it's not something you can do while you're doing anything else. Can't do it while you're out for a walk. You're going to bump into
safely,
them.
yeah.
Yeah, safely, exactly. Although I actually saw a woman, this beautiful woman with long blonde hair in Paris, just walking through a Paris street, holding a book at arm's length in front of her and reading it. And all I could think is, oh, come on. It's like, could Paris be any more Paris-like? Cut it. But so I fell behind on the comics. So I'm not the best guy. Spurgeon would probably be better to give a good summation of everything out there,
Well, you mentioned your editorship of Best American Comics that came out last year, the 2014 volume. What can you tell us about your experience doing that?
I can tell you it's really hard. If you talk to Jeff Smith, he'll tell you the same thing. It's really, really hard. It's hard choosing. It's hard reading, like 20,000 pages or whatever it comes to. I don't know. It's probably not quite that much, but it's a lot. But it was good work. It was good, rewarding work. The only problem is that the book went long. That is, the Sculptor went long. So I was supposed to have long since been done with it, and we were still finishing it while I was working on Best American Comics, which was also when I was doing all these trips that I had taken on, which was also when I was beginning a 2.5-month class in Tennessee. So there was the busiest spring of my life. It was just insane trying to finish Best American. If Best American at times seems a little bit hyper or giddy or hallucinogenic, like I'm beginning to lose my way or whatever, it's because it was like written, in a frantic, binge in an airport, or like, it's good that it was very modular, because it's like sort of a sushi platter approach where there are 10 different mini introductions and all. That was good because siloing them off into these little things allowed me to attend to the structure of each and every tiny introduction and the ideas therein. But Yeah, yeah. Some of the craziness of that book comes from the craziness of that season, I think.
It's funny because you see it as a little crazy, and I remember us talking about this on the podcast when we reviewed Best American Comics 2014 at the, close to the tail end of last year. I mean, I remember thinking that it was probably one of the most cohesive of the Best American Comics volumes that I can remember.
Well, thanks, but I mean, it's also a little bit, let's say, eccentric. I mean, like I literally scold the reader for not reading it in order at one point. What kind of editor does that? That's nuts. But I just thought, okay, let's allow this to be a little bit more flamboyant, a little more fun. But obviously, yeah, no, I still was thinking about structure. I'm still, Mr. Taxonomist guy. I was still trying to make logical choices, and no, there were some very painful exclusions in that one. There were also some painful. Well, of course, the most painful exclusion was we couldn't get Hawkeye. Hawkeye was actually in there because I wanted at least one superhero comic, so that I could say, "Hey, here it is, all the way from A to Z. This is comics in America." But there were rights issues that prevented us from getting it, and that was a shame. But there were also things that were published a week too early or a week too late, and that was frustrating. I would have loved to be the guy who put Jesse Jacobs in there, but Jeff snagged Jesse Jacobs. I would have loved to include Jim Woodring, but Jim Woodring's Fran, I think it was, came out like a week afterwards.
Yeah.
Couldn't put This One Summer in because This One Summer came out just a little bit too late. So there were a lot of great comics that didn't make the cut. But even so, I mean, my God, look at the thing. There's so many amazing comics, and they're all so incredibly different. So I guess I took my mission partially as curator and, picking the cream of the crop, but also as a surveyor, as somebody who was giving you a bit of a core sample, who was picking the best of any number of categories. So yeah, there was logic to it. There was reason. It was at least partially a scientific enterprise. But when it came time to actually write those intros, I was pretty loopy.
Well, how did this come about? I mean, did the previous series editor, Jessica Abel and Matt Madden, did they approach you originally?
Yeah, they had approached me a few years before. And I just kept putting it off because there was so much on my plate. Because at least I had the good sense to know it was going to be a lot of work. And we finally picked a time when I was like, all right, I know I'm going to be done with everything. Now, this is safe enough. I'm going to be long done with the book. Didn't work out that way.
Are things slowing down now?
For a couple of months, yeah. Amazingly. I have a couple of months where I can actually work on the new book. Ivy and I have this running joke that it's always the book. So if it's like Ivy and I are talking about it now, I'll say, oh yeah, I can work on the book now. And except now it's a new book. It's just whatever's on my table at the time is the book. Although, actually towards the end, I think the Sculptor was referred to as the fucking book. The goddamn book. As in, finish the goddamn book, will you?
Oh, okay, there you go. I'm going to have to put an explicit indicator for iTunes.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. We do it all the time.
Actually, finish the damn book, I think, was the more common one, if that's slightly on the side of not quite explicit. Finish the damn book. I think that was the more common adjective, actually. Okay. That was like the last 6 months worth was, okay, all right, let's finish the damn book already.
So is the current damn book the one that you previously mentioned on visual communication? Yeah,
still in its early stages, but that's definitely the next book. This is about the common principles of visual communication and visual education, everything from information graphics to data visualizations to nonfiction comics and animation, anything that's meant to teach, how we learn by seeing, basically.
Well, how much of this approach do you feel is informed by the work and your admiration of Will Eisner?
Well, Will Eisner is definitely. There's a quote by Will where he said that he thought that nonfiction we had only seen the tip of the iceberg, and he thought that it was one of the greatest untapped, potentials in comics was nonfiction. And I think he's prescient on that one, as he often was. And he got to practice it with the PS series. But yeah, no, I think he had very good instincts when it came to that. But a lot of it is just, I don't know. I always have these extracurricular interests, like digital media and all. And one of my interests is just the way we communicate with pictures. I'm taking a lot of pictures of those universal symbols that you see in airports and hotels. I'm just compulsively taking pictures all over the world of how we try to boil down things into a few simple shapes. And a lot of the misunderstandings that we have. This stuff has been creeping into my lectures a lot recently. I have a lot of work to do on data visualizations because that's an information graphics generally, which is actually a pretty sophisticated discipline now. But the thing is, I think that all these different disciplines, they're knocking at the same door. And I think especially in a post-print world, I think that there are certain principles we haven't quite grappled with yet that underlie all these different disciplines. And I'm going to see if I can figure out what they are. I've described it as it's sort of my attempt to write in elements of style for visual communication.
That's really fascinating because I've noticed just in my own teaching, I teach a lot of freshman composition, and that course over the last 10 years or so has moved more and more into visual arguments and visual rhetoric on top of written rhetoric, and that many freshman composition courses are actually requiring as part of their learning outcomes that students walk away with some abilities at visual rhetoric.
Yeah, and there are some important thinkers emerging in that area. Tufte, of course, has been there pretty much from the beginning of this period. When I was in Chile, I got to meet Junko. I've forgotten her last name, actually. I bet I could call her up here. And who has written about the visual rhetoric in children's books, which I think is really interesting. When teachers ask me, what sort of books should they look at in let's say high school or college classes where they're just writing about comics or trying to take comics apart, I always suggest they start with a wordless book, something like Sean Tan's The Arrival.
Oh God, yeah.
Because then you have to engage with the pictures as text. You don't have a choice, because otherwise I think people tend to default to analyzing it as a story, analyzing the text, just trying to pull out the dialogue and just talking about it as they would anything else, any other written text. But you can't do that, you can't do that if you only have pictures in front of you. You have to begin to talk about the ways in which the pictures communicate. Her name, by the way, is Junko Yokota. It's Junkoyokota. I saw her present at this conference in Chile, and I thought she had some really great observations about how much is communicated through pictures in these stories, and we got to talk to her at length at that conference.
What you said is really interesting, because one of the things I often struggle with when I teach comics is coming from an English literature training and background. I feel like I have to be extra self-conscious not to just talk about the words, because that's what I would naturally lean toward in any other medium.
Right. Yeah. No. It's of course, and there's a lot to talk about there. I mean, it's not as if that's not fertile ground.
Right.
But yeah, we do have that natural tendency to immediately go to the plot, the themes, the characters. But a lot can be communicated just with the position of an object in the panel. A lot can be communicated by the panel structure itself. It's one of the reasons the City of Glass is, I think, the most teachable comic out there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That thing is incredible. Students find so much meaning in the visuals when they begin to dig in. I used it as a book club selection in the middle of my course in Tennessee, and my students just amazed me in how many things they found in City of Glass.
Yeah, I want to, I guess, underscore what Andy said, because I have found myself feeling the same thing, that I tend to privilege the words over the images whenever I teach comics. And it's not just the words themselves, but I guess it's the larger issue of narrative. So coming to comics, whether I focus on the words and bring in more or less of the image part of it, my emphasis is always on what story does it tell. And now, granted, I think that's a really, really big part of reading and teaching comics. But I always appreciate having at least one student in my class whose major, if it's an undergraduate course, whose major is art. And in fact, the very first time I taught a comics course, it wasn't a comics course proper, but I turned my multi-ethnic American lit class into a multi-ethnic American comics course. And so I made sure that since this was something brand new on campus, I advertised a lot. I probably overemphasized my flyers over in the art department because I wanted to make sure that I got some art students. And they were able to bring an awareness that the other students and myself included, just normally wouldn't. And I always appreciated those students in the class because they can look at the art and what it does, how it functions outside of narrative, but then along with the storytelling aspect as well.
Well, I'd be curious to know if you guys gave it a try, like how it goes, to just begin with a wordless text. Because, think for a moment. You just picture, you guys have seen Sean Tan's The Arrival, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, just think for a moment. Picture that book. Imagine sequences from that book. Okay, how many channels of narrative communication are available to you in that book? There's facial expressions. There's body language. There's the choice of imagery that represents the unfamiliar, as a way of forcing the reader to experience the kind of alien quality of moving to a new land, which Tan presumably experienced when he moved to Australia from, where was it, Malaysia? I don't remember. There's the pacing. You can talk about, like, how does it affect the speed of our reading, that these panels are small and this panel is big. Like, why did he pull out to a full page here, but here he has 16 panels in a row that are very small? Why did he do that? What did that accomplish? Like, there's so much to talk about. And they have to talk about it, because otherwise there's nothing to talk about, right? Because there are no words. You're just tossing them off the trapeze without a net. They have to find something to grab onto.
Well, how do you find it a challenge, if a challenge at all, to bring together your roles as artist, creator, and teacher?
Well, I'm only a teacher when I'm teaching. well, no, that's not true. That's not true, because I guess the books they're teaching tools. But I don't know. I've always tried, even when I was a kid, even when I was 21 years old and working at DC Comics, my first job in comics, I was still the guy at the water cooler, was grabbing editors and trying to share ideas with them. I've always tried to have it as, to produce the sense that I'm sharing this crazy idea I had, and I want to know what you think of it, rather than, sit down, listen, let me teach you. Because I don't think most of the ideas really are just tools for thinking. This is a phrase I think that Seymour Papert uses. There are these filters that you can use to see the world with, but they're not really guidelines. They're not really rules. There are very few of them are ways to ensure, success or accuracy or a perfect page or whatever. They're just stuff you can use to make things. And isn't that cool? That's sort of the attitude that I always took in all of the books, I think.
Well, Scott, we want to thank you for coming on the podcast and talking with us, not only about the Sculptor and not only about understanding comics, but larger philosophies of your role as both a creator and a teacher, because I see those two going hand in hand.
I guess so. Well, no one's a better teacher in comics than Chris Ware now, and I don't know that he's ever taught a single class. But, that guy's teaching us all, what the medium can do. So, the truth is that comics history is filled with people who are teaching us the boundaries of this art form that we chose by example.
Well, thanks a lot, Scott.
Thank you.
That was exciting to get a chance to talk to Scott McCloud about not only about his new work, but just about teaching comics. Since you and I have both used his work in the classroom, to be able to talk to the man about that experience and that work was exciting.
Yeah, and it's interesting that our conversation ended with the teaching. Once we got into that topic, I was asking myself, it's like, why didn't we do this earlier? Because I was really getting into his suggestions. And, when he said that it would be a great exercise for us to use Sean Tan's The Arrival, I hadn't thought of that before, but that's a great idea.
Yep.
Yeah, great way to start. So it was a wonderful interview. We want to thank Scott for that. And in fact, I also want to thank him for something that he said to us after we finished recording. Many times there's some great things that creators say after we cut off the recording. And he made a comment about being on a few podcasts recently. And how did he put it? He said he wanted to make sure that there are certain ones that he got on, and major North American podcasts, and he included us in that.
Yeah, that was. I was wondering if he thought maybe he was talking to different people.
Yeah, but hey, I'll take what I can get. So if Scott McCloud thinks that we are a major North American podcast, then we must be a major North American podcast. I'm going to take that and run with it.
Yep.
Yeah. And if you want to find out not only what a great North American podcast is all about, but a great American comics retailer is all about, you can visit the website of our sponsor, and the sponsor's Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com. You'll find that it's an incredibly great place to get your funny books. Those guys know their comics, and they have the best prices available. So check them out. And after you do go to DCB Service, get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things that you're going to be reading. You can go to the website and click on the Send Voicemail tab that you'll find on the right side of your browser. And through the miracles of SpeakPipe, leave us a voicemail through your desktop or mobile device. It's just that simple. Or you can get in touch with us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are two guys at comicsalternative.com. Or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we have our Twitter feed where we announce new content to the podcast as well as updates to the blog. You can check out our Twitter feed at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, and on Instagram. And also you can check out our new YouTube channel where you can listen to our podcast via YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can also stream us on Stitcher, and you can also find us on TuneIn. But you can still find every single one of our episodes that we've ever put up, as well as all of our reviews and comics-related commentary that we put up on the blog at the website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how you're doing.
And we like to hear from you, so get in touch with us that way or participate on the forum. So let us know that you're listening and what you think of our conversation with Scott McCloud.
Yeah.
Until then, next time, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.